Hello, everybody. Welcome here to Wine with Jimmy. Great to have you on board. And welcome to a series here on the wines of Armenia. Yes, we always like to focus on everything in the world of wine, but we like to bring attention here at Wine with Jimmy to regions that don't have as much airtime but are making beautiful wines. And Armenia certainly fits that bill. I'm going to go through a 6-part thriller on the wines of Armenia, going through its history, its climate, its weather, its grape variety, its topography, key areas and key producers. And it's going to be fascinating to take you through these wines and wineries and places. So please join me on this wonderful journey. If you ever have a question or a comment, perhaps you've been to Yerevan or one of the key regions of Armenia, or you've tried the wines, or even if you haven't, please comment. It's great to hear from you. We like our community to be sharing ideas, to be asking others for information. And of course, I will be included in that as well. So let's rock and roll. Click like and subscribe, please, too. We really want to see those fingers. We begin by looking at the history of Armenia as it pertains to wine. Our opening slide there is a dramatic and gorgeous backdrop, as you'll see here. This is the Tatev Monastery, one of the country's oldest and most celebrated monastic complexes. It's proudly perched on an outcrop in the Sunya province, 5 hours southeast of Armenia's capital, Yerevan, the Pink City. The monastery is accessible via cable car on the wings of Tatev, the world's longest reversible aerial tramway. So, yes, this is the parts that we'll be going through in this video. It's the history. All of these parts are available as free content here on the World of Wine with Jimmy. So let's talk about location to begin with, and then get stuck into some history as it pertains to the wine side of things. So where are we looking? So Armenia. Now, Armenia is often overshadowed by a lot of its sister nations around it. There's a lot of banterful, friendly rivalry with the likes of Georgia, which I'm very much subject to. I spend a lot of time in Georgia, and it's often seen to be in the shadow of someone like Georgia, which is now really enjoying quite remarkable international acclaim for both its culture, gastronomy, and also wine. It's a small place, so it's landlocked. It's in the South Caucasus, and it's really where Europe meets Asia, as we have discussed in other videos as pertaining to Georgia. It's bordered by Georgia to the north, by Azerbaijan to the east, Iran to the south, and Turkey to the west. But despite its size, it's not the size that matters. Armenia has incredibly diverse terrain, from dry lowland plains to high mountain peaks. One of the most iconic landmarks, which will be heavily featured throughout the whole of these 6 parts, is what we call Mount Ararat, which is now just across the Turkish border. It holds deep cultural and significant historical importance to the Armenians. Now, Armenia's location, just like Georgia, is at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, and it's helped to shape its history. Sitting between really major ancient empires, the Romans, Persians, Byzantines, Ottomans, and Russians, it became a meeting point for trade, for ideas, and for agronomy, for agriculture. The strategic position made Armenia really important in terms of the early trade routes, including branches of the Silk Road. And you must look out. There's a brilliant book by Peter Frankopan, on the Silk Road. Do look out for that. It's fantastic. The country's rugged topography and high altitudes play a major role in shaping its rather unique viticultural conditions, so its grape growing conditions. The capital city is Yerevan. You'll see it in blue. It's kind of light blue in the central southwestern part of the country. It's nicknamed the Pink City thanks to its sort of rose and coral coloured tough stone buildings. And it's a gorgeous place. It's, of course, got the airport. It's full of sidewalk cafes, tree-lined avenues, and open-air markets. So, history. According to the Bible, after the flood was over and the high waters receded, Noah's Ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And what's the first thing that Noah did? It wasn't to count the animals, wasn't to repair the boat. Apparently, it was to plant a vineyard, and he made wine and got drunk. Apparently. So this is, of course, somewhat mythology to some people, of course. But, of course, we know that growing a vineyard to make wine from it will take something like 3 years to actually get to that point. So it's not a short-term fix. Now, legends like to say a lot about how deeply rooted wine is in the story of human civilization. In fact, it's one of the pillars of being what we would classify as being civilized. It was the Romans who would say that barbarians were barbarians because they drank wine neat. It's much more civilized to have wine in delicate amounts, in moderation. Not saying they didn't get drunk, but to blend it with water, of course. And modern science doesn't actually disagree entirely with this notion. The archaeologist and wine researcher Patrick McGovern believes that stories like these carry traces of real memory. Ararat, he says, sits right near some of the earliest Neolithic settlements where grapes were first domesticated, where grapevines turned from being silvestris, Vitis silvestris, wild vines, to what we call Vitis vinifera. Regardless of how real the Noah legend is and whether or not you believe in religious mythology, Armenia is without a doubt one of the oldest centres of viticulture on earth. And we talk very much about Anatolia, Georgia, we talk about Armenia, we talk about Mesopotamia, and even across to places like what we would say today as Lebanon, Israel, as Palestine, being really sort of hotbeds of the original viticultural landscape. So what about some claims to fame? Of course, in Georgia, up north, they have that Patrick McGovern claim to find those seeds that date back out 8,000 years. And that is the marketing of Georgia, right? It is 8,000 years of history behind it. So, with Armenia, we have the Areni 1 cave found in southern Armenia, and there's a picture of it, as you'll see here on your slide. Scientists found a complete winemaking site which dates to 6,000 years old. So the evidence is found in Georgia, but the real winemaking side of things found here in Armenia. Wine press, fermentation vats, drinking bowls, grape seeds and skins, and even dried vines. They tested the residue and found malvodin, a pigment that only comes from red grapes. And the grapes match Vitis vinifera, the same species we use for wine today. We can clearly say that what we have in Western Europe, and therefore across the world, stems from countries, excuse the pun, like Armenia. So this wasn't only symbolic or sacred, it was practical. Someone was pressing grapes, fermenting juice, and storing wine in the karas, which we'll talk about later, all underground in a cool, stable cave. It's the earliest known example of a full cycle wine production anywhere in the world, and absolutely imperative to visit if you are visiting Armenia. Further history. One of the earliest and most important countries on the territory of modern Armenia was the kingdom of Urartu, spread across the Armenian highlands, including parts of modern-day Armenia, Turkey, and Iran from the 9th to 6th centuries BCE. Urartu was centered around Lake Van and the Ararat Valley, a fertile plain that they called the Land of Vineyards, found in documentation. The Urartians built a sophisticated irrigation system carved into volcanic rock to support large-scale viticulture, and some of those canals are still in use today. The 8th century BCE, the Assyrian king Sargon II wrote about crossing into Armenian lands, and he described the enormous volume of vineyards, fruit trees, and giant wine vessels, the karasses, filled with local wine. His soldiers, of course, drank their fill and destroyed what was left, as was so much of the medieval times. Further in the ancient kingdoms, further east in the Persian capital of Persepolis, a stone relief that you see here shows an Armenian envoy bringing wine as a tribute. The Greek historian Herodotus described a wine trade running straight from Armenia to the ancient city of Babylon down the Euphrates. Wine travelled in round hide boats, and once the cargo was sold, the boat were dismantled and carried back north on donkeys because it was impossible to traverse it back. So it's actually easier to dismantle the boat and then by land take it back up to repeat the process, what we could call rinse and repeat. This wasn't small scale production, it was a full supply chain, and Armenia was right at the centerpiece of it. In 301 AD, Armenia becomes the first country to adopt Christianity as state religion, followed by Georgia. Throughout the medieval period, monastic communities across Armenia, like those at the Norvank, the Hagopat, and the Tatev, were major centers learning of agriculture. So the Tatev monastery that you saw on your first picture of this presentation. There's a 6th century mosaic in Jerusalem showing Armenian inscriptions alongside images of vine rows, which you see on the picture on the left of your slide. It was found in a chapel near the Damascus Gate, proof that the Armenian winemakers had influence well beyond their homeland. But Armenia wasn't politically stable. From the 5th to the 19th century, Armenian lands were fought over and divided by various empires. The Byzantines, Arabs, the Seljuks, Mongols, of course, with the Golden Horde, the Persians, the Ottomans, and the Russians. In some regions, Armenians supplied wine to Muslim rulers, and even under Islamic law, where drinking was forbidden, Armenians were allowed to make and sell wine, especially in cities like Tabriz, Aleppo, and of course the Pink City of Yerevan. Now, in the 19th century, especially after Eastern Armenia becomes a part of the Russian Empire in 1828, more formalized viticulture was established. French and Russian techniques began to influence the production, laying a groundwork for the Soviet wine system, which I discuss quite heavily within the Georgian wine history. In the 20th century, Armenia was a part of the Soviet Union, and every republic had a specialization within the beast of the Soviet Union. Armenia was assigned mostly to brandy. Almost all grapes went into making so-called Armenian cognac, especially under the Ararat and Noi labels. These became Soviet symbols, luxurious, export-ready, and politically useful. You'll see some bottles there on the picture. But Armenia didn't stop there. It became one of the few Soviet republics producing sherry-style wines, and in 1931, Armenian scientists discovered a unique yeast film forming in karasses. They're the clay pots, similar to the floor used in Spanish sherry. They named it Saccharomyces armeniensis, so Armenia. Armenian sherry made from Voskehat and Shilar grapes won multiple international records. The Ashtarak winery became a standout, competing globally. And so even during a time of centralized production, Soviets, Armenian wine still found a way to somewhat express itself with quite a lot of caveats. Of course, the Soviet Union did not last forever, and its collapse in the late 80s meant that Armenia would enter its new chapter. So it's time finally for Armenia doing things on its own terms. Armenia gained independence in 1991, and winemaking has gone from a quiet tradition to a national revival. Forgotten grape varieties are now being rescued and replanted. Wineries are popping up across the country, some large, many, many small, but they're not just copying international examples. They've seen somewhat of success with the Georgians and their international success, but with autochthonous grape varieties. So they're leaning into what makes Armenia unique: high altitude vineyards, volcanic soils, and grapes like Areni, Voskehat, and Areni. International enologists are now collaborating with producers here. There's some money coming in from outside, and wine routes such as the one up in the north, and the festivals and tourism projects are building a new culture around the wine. It's deeply connected to its ancient past. Picture of the Yerevan Wine Days merchandise. Well, thank you very much for joining me on this first section of Armenia Wine, looking at the history. We're next going to go focus on what makes it special in terms of the meteorological side of things with climate and weather. If you do have any comments or questions, please do get in touch. You could do so by commenting below. Did I miss something out in terms of history? I do apologize about all pronunciation. As you know, being Wine with Jimmy, I have to cover all the countries of the world, and not everything, of course, will roll off the tongue. Now, please do get in touch if you have any further recommends you'd like to get in touch, but please do otherwise enjoy me for part 2. And if you're in the UK, come and say hi for a glass or bottle. I've been Jimmy Smith. Ciao for now. Bye-bye.